Hi, everybody. This is Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. And this week we have a special returning guest, Kirk Nurmi. He's pretty darn famous. In his own bio, he describes himself as rising to international prominence as the lead counsel for the infamous Jodi Arias trial. The stress of that case brought cancer into his life, and with the cancer came big changes, a whole new life, a life wherein happiness is now his beacon. Kirk has written for the New York Daily News, he's authored 8 books, he's appeared on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, Court TV regularly, Law and Crime Daily, Dr. Oz, The Mel Robbins Show, and The Today Show. He's a great, great man, a very, very smart and interesting man, and I am so proud to consider him a personal friend at this point. So, Kirk, welcome to the show.
Well, it's great to be back.
I didn't know that I was name dropping you when I was talking to an old friend from high school. This is like before we met. So I had booked you for the show, and I don't even remember who introduced us. But and I just said to him like casually, it wasn't even related to something we were talking about. And he's like, "Wait, are you serious?" And then he brought up the famous trial, and he just said, well, and it was funny too because he said he was a fan of yours. So I just thought that was really. I was like, I didn't know people are fans of attorneys. Like that's really cool.
Well, sometimes the line between televised trials and reality TV is blurred. I think we probably talked about that a little bit on our last meeting, but I think that's definitely true. And so, I appreciate the fandom, but yeah, that is definitely the case, I think.
Yeah, and obviously, like I've had you on multiple times, so most of our listeners probably are regular and know. But you've, like you said in your bio, you've really changed. I mean, and life has brought you just tons of great changes, and I was so thrilled. I got to meet you and your wife when you came down for my book signing, so it's really cool to I know this sounds very corny to some people, but to feel your energy in person is different from on the phone.
Well, likewise, it was a pleasure to meet you and your wife and attend your book signing and read your book.
Cool. Awesome. So today's episode is going to be very different from most of my regular episodes. I'm not going to ask you what you think happens when you die, because we already have that on record. And I'm also not going to really ask you to talk about your philosophy of death, but I am going to ask you all sorts of questions about what I just call criminology. And as a subtext, just maybe to help you understand the direction I'm really moving in, I became really interested in this subject when I was much, much younger, because I always had a fear of going to prison. I wasn't a bad kid. I didn't do a lot of bad things. I smoked pot. That was about it. But I was just like deathly afraid of going to prison. I was afraid of like prison specifically. I don't really care to get into why, but it wasn't like a good or bad reason. It was just my culture had informed me that if you're bad, you can go to prison, and prison is very scary. And then recently I was indexing a book that referred to the subject of criminology as social control, and something just clicked in my brain, and I said, oh, now I get it. There's just really social control is what's going on. And then within that, we have this umbrella of what we call crime and not crime, and then how to control what we call criminals. So I'd like to start there with, are you familiar with the term social control? Do you like that term? Do you have a reaction to that term?
Well, I think all laws inherently have an element of social control, I like to think of, like I say, all laws are social control. There's some that are transactional and some that are moral.
Mm-hmm.
And the transactional, to just enhance what I'm saying here a little bit, the transactional might be the speed limit. The transactional might be how we deal with each other in business. It also deals with, for example, not assaulting each other, things of that nature, right? Not invading one's home, things of that nature, how we deal with each other. But then there's another umbrella of moral provisions that might fall along the lines of, the legality of marijuana back in the Prohibition days, who can be legally married, things of that nature. So every single law really is, social control has an ominous sound to it, but at the same time, each and every law we have is kind of I would use the word societal contract that we've all agreed to live under.
Yeah. Which actually, that's really when I got into philosophy, was when I was introduced to the social contract, and then like virtually any person who understands it, I was like, well, I don't remember signing this, but okay, I guess I'm in this. And actually, that's a really good next question for me to ask you, which is, how do you feel now today, and I don't mean politically, I just mean like literally in the nation of America on November 13th, 2024, do you feel like we are still honoring the same social contract that as it was developed 400 years ago, or do you think like maybe we have like a different opinion or version of it now?
Well, to say it's the same as say when we founded this nation is just not true. Because let's face it, things change, things evolve. So when we talk about there's no stasis in law, there's no stasis in the social contract. It always evolves. And to that, I mean, look, there were no speed limits before there were cars. There was no, DUI laws until prohibition was lifted, things of that nature, right? So there is an evolution and that is always constant with the evolution of society as well as the changing moral standards. So what was once considered moral might someday be considered amoral and vice versa.
Cool. Great. And since I already brought it up once and you echoed it back, like something I've heard a lot of people complain about really recently is like I'll give an example. A lot of friends of mine went to Vegas recently and they said, I couldn't stand it. It smells like marijuana everywhere. It's so annoying. And I completely understand what they're talking about. And I can see how like we've swapped like the stink of tobacco for the stink of marijuana now, but with one big difference, which is people are worried about contact highs, which I don't think there's any actual medical, evidence of that, but still, and like explaining to their children. But at the same time, I counter that with, well, how do you explain why you have a beer and your kid can't have one? So I'm curious specifically with like the social contract that we just discussed, the lack of stasis, and then with marijuana, because we both live in Arizona where it's become legal recently, do you think we're handling the proliferation of things like marijuana, gambling on sports, like all these new freedoms? How are you viewing that?
Well, I don't think any of the states, and Arizona certainly wasn't the first, right? I mean, Washington and Oregon, I think were probably some of the early adopters to legalize marijuana. I know Colorado's probably right up there too, and they've also, to my understanding, at least Colorado and Oregon to some extent, have legalized psychedelic mushrooms. So, and the point being, none of those states have fallen into the ocean. None of them have fallen into massive distress. Some of the arguments, I mean, it's funny when we talk about marijuana laws specifically, some of the fear related to marijuana is tied back to a propaganda film in the 1920s called Reefer Madness. And those fears were proliferated over the years, which kept marijuana to be the boogeyman. But, like, as I said, none of those states have fallen into disrepair. And I will say, having practiced criminal law for 14 years, I never had a crime other than the possession or selling of marijuana that was perpetrated by marijuana consumption as opposed to alcohol consumption, which would lead to DUI charges, but also other crimes, domestic violence, assaults, various crimes. So there was a lot more crimes related to alcohol than marijuana. And some of those conceptions, as a child of the 80s, Nancy Reagan, just say no. Mm-hmm. A lot of people might remember that. And that was just marijuana became the boogeyman. And I think what we're finding out is such is not the case.
Yeah, I would actually say Nancy Reagan is probably more directly responsible for my fear of prison than a lot of people in the history of my life. So yeah, that's great reference. And I definitely do remember that. And it's interesting because it really does work going into schools. There's a brief period where it works. I remember like everyone in my school was telling people like, put that cigarette out. That's bad for you, and then unfortunately there's also the complete buck, which is when you see that it's not as demonic as they may have told you. So, again, like that actually segues into, I guess I'll just stay a little on topic. How do you feel about the evolution of juvenile deviance and like handling juvenile cases specifically? Like, for example, Texas has, I think, put to death, and I'm not really asking about your opinion of the death penalty because that would be too much of a topic to cover in this specific question. But like, so just how do you feel about separating juveniles from adults? Do you think that's fair? Do you think that's the right way to do things? Do you have any experience with that?
I handled a few juvenile cases back in my day, not too many because I did a lot of other sort of crimes, and then went to the death penalty, which is not available for juveniles in Arizona. And you have to be 18, I believe. It is nationwide to be considered for the death penalty in our current Supreme Court case law. What I would say in general is that, there is a proliferation of cases. Obviously, we've had, a case that brought a lot of national attention, both for its horror and for the relationship of charging the parents. It's the case of Crumbly, 17-year-old Ethan Crumbly going into the school and shooting several of his classmates, and then his parents being charged and learning more about his background, what have you. And I bring that as an illustration. Obviously, that's a bigger discussion, but we cannot look past the fact that. And you know what? I'm gonna bring another case to mind that is probably more in people's attention is that of Eric and Lyle Menendez, right? The claims of sexual abuse and the fallout and whether you believe it or not, I tend to believe it. I tend to believe there's evidence. I tend to believe their behavior was consistent with those who are victim of abuse. But we have to realize that childhood trauma and sexual abuse as well as physical abuse can actually physically reshape the brain and cause the thinking malfunctions. So for us to look at an unformed brain in the way we do a formed brain and or a manipulated brain that is greatly affected by trauma in the same way that we look at one that is not, I think that does society a disservice, because we have to be greater than the least among us. And, love is what heals the planet, and ultimately hoisting equal condemnation on both such parties, adults and children, doesn't seem to be, to me, a fruitful mechanism of social control, if you will, going back to the original point.
Yeah, wow, that was such a great answer. You're getting A+ on all your answers to this fake professor who's interviewing you. What you just reminded me of, and it's a pretty quick question, is since you have decades of experience in law, I'm curious. I was attracted to law, and I didn't actually go into it, but I was very attracted to it. I was attracted to it because I wanted to be, and literally, I was the most idealistic, college senior ever. I wanted to be a pro bono attorney for people, who can't afford attorneys. I wanted to be a basic defense counsel. I thought it was noble. So I'm just curious, in your decades of experience, do you feel like the average person who enters specifically law, so not policing, not prisons, but just law, do you think that they're out to stop bad people or they're out to help people? Do you see the difference that I'm asking?
Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks.
Well, I see the difference that you're asking, but I think probably both sides of that coin would say that they are trying to help people.
Yeah.
Prosecutors would say they are trying to help crime victims get a sense of justice, and those who are public defenders, so we're talking about public servants instead of necessarily pro bono attorneys, we're talking about, someone who is looking to help those who are accused of crime, sometimes the underdog. Sometimes people are wrongfully accused of a crime. I mean, I know that I went to law school a little later in life and did so with the idea of becoming a public defender because I believed in the construct of the Constitution and those Sixth Amendment rights. And I didn't feel like, money should be the dividing line between those two things. So I think both those who go into public service do it with an air of nobility.
Okay. That definitely makes sense to me. And then kind of ancillary to that, do you feel like there should be a test or a measurement for burnout among people in the legal field? Because people can get hardened and embittered, and now I am including judges.
Well, I know no test for such a thing.
Yeah.
And if there was a test for such a thing across any profession, probably a lot of people will burn out. What I would say is that there are, when you talked about, being a lawyer and what have you, and the idealism, I'm for you, for the sake of your happiness, I'm glad you chose an alternate path. And I say that because there's not really a lot of happy lawyers. And, we may have touched on this in prior conversations, but there's not, because of the stress. Every profession has its stresses, of course, but, looking at the parent of a child and telling them that their son or daughter is facing the death penalty is not a light day at the office. Some of the stressors involved going to the jail, hearing some of the tragic stories of abuse and things that attorneys hear. Likewise, being a prosecutor and seeing crime scene photos, things of that nature can also be very obviously traumatizing to some extent. And so what really it comes down to, as opposed to a test, and if there is one, I guess, it's the query that I challenged myself with years ago when I decided to ask the bar for disbarment was, am I happy? And making that confrontation is something that's certainly not limited to the profession of law. I think it's something that more people should do because I talk about this in my book, Defend Your Greatness. We have to live with a level of joyful urgency. And when we are steeped in the trauma and the drama of the world, sometimes it's hard to do that. Some lawyers are happy, some aren't. But making that check-in is so important regardless of what profession we're in.
Wow. I really, really respect that. And I really hope that that's not lost in the shuffle of what we're talking about today, because that is really just, I think, my goal, especially I'm in my 40s now, and it just becomes more and more clear that all I should have been doing my whole life is helping people help me and help ourselves to achieve what you're talking about, which is making joyful decisions and understanding that every moment really is precious. And so I think that kind of is what my overall meta approach to this interview is, which is I'm trying to figure something out. And I know that it's related to, but wasn't started in the summer of 2020 when there were protests with the popular phrasing of defund the police. And I remember being terrified because even though I lived in a community where we have what I would consider somewhat healthy policing, I have lived in Oakland, California for more than 10 years. And there's not a single person I know there ever of any race who actually wants to defund the police unless they literally are criminals. It is, it's terrifying. And yet I would say all of us also don't really think that the police make us feel safe. So it's like this weird tap dance. And then from that, what this book started making me think about with social control is we do all want to feel safe. We want to know that when we're in our house, we shouldn't expect someone to run in with a gun and not only just rob us, but actually murder us. Like we don't want Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. Like we want to prevent, I think virtually every American would agree that what those people did and how that went down is something we all want to prevent. So then I started thinking about what percentage of people are afraid of the punishment system in America, and I am one of them. So I think that's a healthy thing as a deterrent. We call it deterrence, So the way I'm going to ask this question, I thought a lot about this. To save myself and you time, I'm going to list 7 words that all kind of float in the same category in my mind, and ask me to repeat them if you want. And then I'm just curious, like which ones you would separate, which ones you would lump together, and just kind of what they evoke with your legal experience. And I can slow this down and repeat them, so don't feel a lot of pressure.
Okay.
But I'm going to list the words, and I think this will work, just based on how well I know you. Punishment, incarceration, rehabilitation, corporal punishment, corrections, prison, retribution, shame.
Yes, that's what I say. I think there's one thing that would hold that is different, one that stands out. Mm-hmm. And that is the concept of shame, because I think it's distinctly different, and because it is not, for many, it is not a consideration. It flew the coop. I mean, I think that some people that are, say, for example, repeat offenders, there is no sense of shame. It is long past because, and not because they are inherently bad. I mean, but because they're separated, they're detached. So something happened in their lives that detached them from the whole. As in, you might feel shame if you got the impulse to, let's say, steal a candy bar, right? Maybe as a kid, you get the impulse to steal a candy bar. You feel ashamed about it because you're connected to the overall society. When you're disconnected from the overall society, you don't function with that shame. That internal shame is not there. There is anger, there is disconnect. So that kind of feeling is not evoked when you commit criminal acts.
Wow, that's really, really, I think, important for everyone to understand. And I definitely resonates with my experience, which is limited, but still there. I kind of want to go back to one of the terms because I want to get your opinion on it. The word is retribution. Eye for an eye, Hammurabi's Code, oldest law in the books. Do you think that at its core, that is an ethical treatment, punishment?
I don't. I think that because we have a justice system, not a vengeance system. And I think that we have to be better. We have to be guided by our better natures. So I hear a lot of people would say, hey, listen, it doesn't matter how we treat prisoners. We just had the conclusion of the Delphi trial in Indiana, where Richard Allen was convicted of killing 2 young girls. But before he was ever convicted as such, he was held in solitary confinement, lights on, basically elements of torture for about 13 months prior to trial. Pre-trial incarceration, right? Innocent until proven guilty.
Wow.
And to me, those kind of things, those kind of actions are against our better nature. And we need, if we, as a society, to be guided by our better nature. I hear a lot of people say, yeah, they deserve this, they deserve that, what have you, they don't deserve rights. But the United States and the social contract that we developed, and that includes the 8th Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment, basically is a different way of saying we're going to be guided by our better selves. We are going to have more civility than those who act uncivilly against us.
I love it. And so a similar word in the same, conversation, what about the word justice? Like, how would you teach that if you were a law professor?
Justice is whatever someone thinks it is. because it's not going to be the same to anybody. We could look at a trial and say justice was served. A lot of people, when somebody is a victim of a crime, there will be Facebook groups or what have you saying justice for blankety blank. And the prevailing sentiment of most of those people when they say that is that the person that's on trial should be convicted, right? But there is, there's a vengeful element in what some people are casting as justice. But I think justice means so much to different people. Like, we have maybe somebody is defamed. What does that look like? How is that dollar figure, right? And the jury struggles with that. So there is no one definition of justice, because if somebody gets awarded, and I can't remember the infamous McDonald's hot coffee case, right? Somebody gets millions for that. Is that justice? You might think it is. I might think it's not. So it's just an amorphous concept that changes, but and so it's something that is not really tangible. So there's no real sense of what it is, although maybe it feels like justice.
Yeah. And then this is a complicated question, but you sort of started to answer it, and then I think I switched the topic too quickly.
Okay.
While we agree, you and I, that retribution is not in our higher interests, like the higher selves of us, the better part of ourselves, We also do have to admit that there are people who you described, and I agree exist, who have, the system has absolutely messed them up. Whether that system is like bad foster care in childhood, their own parents, it doesn't matter. But something failed them, and they now no longer have a sense of shame, and perhaps they no longer have a sense of goodwill. I'll call it. And this is my wording, so you can feel free to critique any of this.
Yeah.
What should we do with those people? People who, like, we all agree are just at this point appearing to us as wild animals who are incapable of correct behavior.
Well, I think there's many people that fit into a category of persons that I do think should be subject to lifelong incarceration. I believe that's true of those who are pedophiles, have been convicted of acts of pedophilia, because I believe that they do not change, and no matter what age will victimize others again when given the opportunity. I think what you're speaking to, brings back memories of, I think it was California, right? 3 strikes, you're out.
Yeah.
Kind of laws, right? And those might be a bit harsh in their nature, given that the third felony could be something relatively minor. But I think those are certainly, enhanced sentences for those who are repeat offenders is something that is built into the system. And I think that that is rightly the case. When we look at now, it's been long while since I've been in graduate school, but you look at statistical tables for recidivism, and they do greatly drop, when somebody's in their 50s and or 60s, right? So those are considerations in that regard. And I'm personally of the belief as well that those who are convicted of first-degree murder, whether it's first, second time, what have you, should be sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of release.
What about people? This just occurred to me. I did not have this on my roster to ask.
Sure.
What about people who have like a propensity to second-degree murder, like meaning like someone with a temper that clearly can't be controlled? Like,
well, I don't know how you define that. If that, you know what I mean? Like, if someone is convicted of 1 count of second-degree murder and or manslaughter, I don't think that necessarily has to warrant a life term. Your point is well taken, though. I mean, I do think those who show the capacity to kill, it is something that should be subject to long-term incarceration.
And what about like this? Just again, these are all jumping to mind. So I do have other questions, but I am liking this current topic.
Sure.
There was a kid recently in Miami, and when I say kid, I think he was like 18, 19.
Okay.
And he drove his car way too fast, like 80 and a 25 or something crazy like that, with his like dashboard cam on, bragging, and he killed like 2 people. And I don't remember what happened to him, but I'm more curious about this thing we call involuntary manslaughter. I really don't understand it. I've had many people try to explain it to me. What is not the legal definition of it, but the moral imperative for it, like that third division between second and first, I get very easily. What is the intention in like a case like that? Like, is that person, oh, that's involuntary because they didn't think they were going to kill someone? Or is it, no, you can't drive a car 60 and a 25?
It's mindset. So it's so they have, in criminal law, one of the things that you successfully avoided with law school is the discussion on mens rea versus actus rea. Actus rea is the conduct and mens rea is the mindset, right? Mm-hmm. And mens rea is probably most likely in the terms you described, that kind of evil mindset, right? Where somebody is saying, okay, I'm going to mow these people down by going 85 in a 25. We have decided in the law that is different than someone who is joyriding, for example, and not intending to do that, because that becomes the distinction of possibly, I guess one would say in theory, rehabilitation, because that mindset was not there. That pathological mindset was not present.
Cool. Very much switching topics, but also relevant to my interests. I recently, thanks to my wife, watched a Martha Stewart documentary on Netflix, and it reminded me of the time she went to prison. And I was appalled when I watched it because I didn't know she was actually a stockbroker early in her life. So now that I know that, it was laughable that she thought she shouldn't have been sent to prison. She absolutely knowingly participated in insider trading. She made a joke about it to a friend on a boat. That's not the thing I'm trying to bring up. What I am trying to bring up is she, to this day in this documentary, feels like they used her as an example. And recently people said the same thing about Donald Trump with his trial. This is before his election, the one I'm, from this summer. And I've heard it enough times in my life that I'm curious, like, what is that line? Like, do you feel like there's a bad line that we're drawing now? Do you think that we have always done that? Or do you think that that really has a place?
Well, I don't know if I really understand the heart of your question. Are you saying that we are selectively prosecuting to exemplify, or are you talking about the mindset?
It's, to me, inarguable that there have been times where you could have picked a different person, or you just don't have the budget to go after like every single person. So you kind of like use someone and hope that it sends echoes through society. If you disagree with that premise, that's fine. You're an expert. I'm not. So, but I'm kind of going off of that.
Let me say a couple of things. Okay. So this
Sure.
kind of reminds me of, somebody gets pulled over for speeding and there's 5 other cars speeding at the same time. And they say, why don't you stop the other cars?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So obviously that is a mindset of kind of a victim mentality of somebody saying, oh, well, they're not saying they didn't do it. They're just saying, well, everybody's doing this. So therefore, you shouldn't be prosecuting me unless you prosecute everyone else, which isn't true. Now, what a prosecutor decides prosecutors have a great deal of discretion, right? So is it possible that a prosecutor looks at a case and says, this is so-and-so, this could send a message, so I'm going to prosecute this person? You bet. But at the same time, the only reason you know about it is because that person is famous, and there's probably dozens of other cases of people that aren't famous that you don't know about that have gotten charged with the same crime. So there's kind of a reflexive nature of that. But ultimately, we could talk for hours about prosecutorial discretion, but ultimately there is a reality that they could seem like they're being picked on, but it only stands out as that because they're the only case getting attention.
Got it. How do you feel about the increasing use of the Supreme Court to make legal decisions in our country? Do you think that's a good trend, a bad trend, not a trend?
Well, I think it's a bad trend. I mean, our constitutional democracy was set up with the idea that the Supreme Court would not be the maker of laws, but instead the interpreter of laws, and that Congress would be the maker of laws, right? And collectively, Congress would be the maker of laws. And that buck seems to be of past. I mean, when we talk about issues, that should be codified, if you will, as opposed to, whether it's abortion bans, what have you, all these things, really student loan forgiveness, things of that nature, should be things that function through the executive branch and the legislative branch, not the judicial branch. It's not the way our system was designed.
And then how do you feel about, and I've heard people on both sides of the aisle ask it, so I feel very comfortable asking it, but I don't really have an opinion actually on this, but do you feel like they should alter or change the structure of the Supreme Court itself, the National Supreme Court, meaning add more justices or change it to not lifetime appointment?
I have grave reservations as it relates to any altercations because the motivations behind them are typically now agenda driven as opposed to functionality driven. The need for the type of changes that have been brought up and that you put in your question are really facilitated by the idea of the court doing the job of the other branches, which should not be the case. And I don't think there should be a need for any alterations. I do not like the idea of judges having their jobs in jeopardy because of particular rulings, things of that nature. So, the court It's interesting, Mike, because one way to look at all these things is everything has worked just fine for a long time.
Yeah.
And it is only within the last decade that we have decided that we need to burn down the house. And maybe we need to put down the match.
This is why I love talking to you. Thank you. I'll let you know when I disagree with you. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
All right. Fair enough.
So again, just these are all like questions I've kind of collected over the months, because I think I'm just going to have you on every 6 months to answer all my... If you had to pick one area of justice or justice system to reform, so the police would be one branch, the courts would be another branch, the lawmaking entity would be another branch. I'm sure all of them could use reform, but what do you think the most urgent area for reform would be in this country?
Oh, boy. I think the most urgent nature for reform really is probably with the police. The police have the area of first contact. You mentioned the tenuous nature of the relationship between the police and its citizenry, which was, exacerbated greatly and exposed greatly by, Officer Chauvin's choice to murder George Floyd in public. Mm-hmm. And when we think about cases like that, we've had the Karen Reed case where their FBI has to investigate the police officers, things of that nature. Professionalizing our police and giving them the resources they need, to me, is a huge priority, and they all need reform to answer your question. But I think the only reason I pick the police is because that really is where the rubber meets the road, and there should be no citizen in this country that is afraid to call the police. Yeah. And right now, that such is not the case.
And also, I find it interesting. This is just ancillary to my taste, but like, I'm the kind of person who would want to jump on Officer Chauvin's back and start grabbing him and pulling him away. That's my instinct. Of course, I would not do that. I would be like terrified with 3 other officers with guns. But has that happened? Is there like case studies on that? Is that like a thing? Like, is there any even sort of like actual law in place that says, hey, yeah, actually, if a bunch of citizens notice that a police officer is abusing their power, it's okay to do something? Or is that not even like at all in the books?
No, I mean that. If anything, it's just to the contrary. Mm-hmm. The only thing a citizen can do in that situation is literally call the police on the police, because interacting and having that kind of interference, it would probably would be considered, assault on an officer, things of that nature, believe it or not.
No, yeah, I do believe it, sadly. We're about 4 years removed from COVID, maybe 3, especially in Arizona, it feels like 4. But the lockdowns were brutal for nearly everyone, and they were obviously worse in California and other states. Something I've reflected on since that period came and went is we probably should have some sort of a plan in place for the next time there is a either a pandemic or even an epidemic that's sweeping around our nation. Do you think that we should have a law for like a reasonable, air quotes, lockdown, or do you think those are just incredibly unconstitutional, even if like a disease had a 90% fatality rate?
It's interesting when we go back. Goes to your original question, or the framework of this discussion of social contract. And I guess what I would ask then really is, when did we stop caring about each other? Wow. When did politics become such a team sport that we've decided that winning is more important than caring? And so this idea, this outrage, in the early days of COVID about mask mandates and people getting outraged by masks, and still maybe this day, if somebody wants to wear a mask, they're subject to harassment, which I just don't at all conceive. I mean, it's not probably really an answer to your question, but I don't think caring about each other can be legislatively mandated. We have to return to and I think it's our natural state to begin to care about each other, but we need to return to that natural state.
I think that's very fair. I'll just push back a little and reframe the question. Do you think at the very least we should have a national policy for it as opposed to each different state? Since, as people said, you can't pee in one area of the swimming pool and not expect it to affect the other.
Yeah, that is a more complicated question than you might think, because you have issues of federalism and interstate travel and interstate commerce, things of that nature. So you're never going to be able to say nationally that unless you could tie it to something else. Like Reagan famously, going back to Reagan, he said, we're going to cut highway funds if you don't raise the drinking age to 21, because back in the day, us old folks, and I'm not counting you in that, Mike, because you're a young whippersnapper, but those old folks will remember that there were some states had drinking ages 18 and what have you, maybe a little bit lower. And Reagan said, I'm not going to give you any federal highway funds unless you increase the drinking age to 21. So for that, what you're talking about, for some sort of national law to take place, it would have to be tied to, I'm not going to give you any funding for blankety blank if you don't put this mandate in place.
Wow, yeah. And actually, when I was 14, Louisiana was the last state to still have it, and they were famous for their horrible roads. So I was going to apply to Tulane, and then they changed it. So I'm in between. Talk about an immature decision that a teenager would want to make. Okay, I know that like in my plan of plans back when I was that teenager who feared prison, I was just like, okay, well, I just need to memorize how to make sure I'm insane. Like, so as long as I can get to the courtroom and convince everyone I'm insane, then I will not have to go to my worst fear. And instead, and this is, again, a teenager's mindset, I'll go to a place where Jack Nicholson was in that hilarious movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I'll play cards and smoke cigarettes and hang out with people. Is that like a similar fake concern that people are going to fake mental illness to get out of crime?
Yeah, it's. I wish you well if that becomes your situation. I don't think so. Yeah, that's a bit of a misnomer. I don't think, first of all, yes, you don't. People are under the impression that somebody who's insane, they're just going to get let out the front door, and that's not the case. They wind up in a state hospital playing cards, I guess, and smoking. But so that kind of thing is a minimal part of the criminal justice system. And I'm beginning to think, Mike, we need to have a conversation about this fear of prison you're bringing up several times here today.
Well, I can really explain it to you. It's that I don't understand. It's a trust issue. I don't trust. It's wow. Now that you asked it, I feel embarrassed, but I'm going to try to answer it. I don't trust my peers. I don't trust the jury of my peers. I don't trust so many things about the system. And so I just always had this bad, and again, this feeling evaporated around 25, 26, 27, but I just had this bad feeling that, maybe it was watching the Shawshank Redemption. It was just like enough movies and things had informed me that this does happen. People do get falsely accused and they do go to prison. And then when I started to look at what prison was, it wasn't even the rape thing. I know that's what everyone listening probably would have thought, but like it was the brutality of it, just like the dehumanization, the fear of being with the people I already hated growing up, like the bullies, because I imagine it's a lot of highly testosterone driven, like very aggressive people in a maximum security prison. So things like that. Does that help you understand?
Well, I would say this. I've heard what you have to say, but I think, you talked about it 26, 27. I think the things you described, the fears you described, are manifestations of something else and not the actual fear. And I would say that my guess is that at age 26, 27, that's when you began to feel more worthy as a human being. And the reason you had that fear before is that you did not feel worthy as a human being and felt like you should be put away with the bad people.
It's so awesome. I'll tell my wife that I no longer am going to see a therapist about this. No, I'm kidding. That was really good. That was very deep. No, and
Wait till you see my bill.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Kirk, thank you so much. I always like to give my guests the last word, so there will be notes for how to find all of your books and to find you. But in addition to finding you and discovering you and learning from you, is there anything you'd like to leave my audience with?
When we talk about these times and the division in these times, I think it's so unnatural. And I think if we begin to return to who we really are, we're going to find more happiness and more of the unity. It's easy to, hurl names and what have you, but it's also just as easy to step into that natural state that we were born with and carried with us until we were trained otherwise. Hate is trained, dissension is trained, and division is trained. All we need to do is understand that those who trained us in those ways, that's their baggage we're carrying, and life gets a lot lighter when you sit down someone else's baggage.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kirk Nurmi. That was the mic drop of all mic drops. Thank you to everyone for listening. Please head over to MikeyOpp.com. That's MIKEYOPP.com and sign up for the once a week free essay that I write, as well as the announcements for the podcast. Thanks again, Kirk. My name is Mike Oppenheim. You have been listening to Coffin Talk, and we will see you soon.